Western man thinks come from this division. For example, we talk about force, about atom, about field, just in the field of physics. All of these three, of course, are results of certain transformations which took place within Greek thought, as Greek science separated itself from religion and philosophy. But before doing this, we have to try to gain a more objective perspective. As I told you before at the beginning of this class, usual works written by Western historians for the last 400 years base themselves on what's called the Greek miracle. That is, suddenly in the Mediterranean world, while all the rest of the world remained in stupor and immersed in superstition, suddenly these brilliant people called the Greeks opened up their eyes one morning and started asking deep questions which nobody had thought about before, and became the first philosophers and scientists in the world. For example, we study the history of philosophy. It's taught in such a way that philosophy begins with Thales or with Pythagoras. As in one morning, Thales got up and said, now in the name of God, the most merciful and compassionate, let's begin philosophy. It seemed to as if you were a Muslim or something else, or in the name of whatever deity he was talking about. This is the way things are taught. If you take a course on Philosophy 1 or History of Philosophy in this university, and even History of Science, despite the 4,000 years of Babylonian astronomy, that's all relegated to the background, the remarkable achievement of the Egyptians, and suddenly science begins in 6th century BC. Everything seems to begin in 6th century BC. This is actually not the facts, but is a type of history created by the Eurocentrism of the Renaissance. This was not how Europe looked at its own history for 1,300 years before that. Between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, Western man did not look upon its history like this. The Renaissance marks, in fact, the murder of Christian civilization in the West in a certain sense. I'm using a very strong term, but that's what it is. That is, the Christian civilization, which was flowering step by step, was in a sense massacred in the middle of that flowering. And another type of civilization took its place, which we identified with the Renaissance. And since modern Western civilization is a child of that, it looks upon its past history through the revisionist eyes of the Renaissance. We'll never understand the significance of Greek science and its relation with Greek religion in a deeper sense unless we're aware of this type of historiography. And this type of historiography has been challenged very seriously in the 20th century by people like Arnold Toynbee, before that by Spengler in Germany, and of course by the other traditional writers, starting with René Guénon. It's not the uniform way of looking at things, but that has not percolated into the way that things are taught in Western universities and the way the history of everything is developed. For example, we study the history of art. It's taught that as soon as you have the beautiful statue of Apollo because it's humanly beautiful, or the athlete throwing a discus, the famous Greek statue of the 5th century BC, which shows movement in the torso of the statue, that's the beginning of real art. Everything before that was static and did not have movement, and so forth and so on. I must tell you the story to show you how deeply this is ingrained. In the 1950s, when I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, someone brought from Indochina a torso, which according to all indications, scientific indications, belonged to the 9th to 10th century BC. And it showed that the top of the body was broken, and the legs were broken, but the middle of the body was very much evident. And it showed this torso in movement. That is, you could see as if there was somebody moving. Now that made a lot of noise, and all of the professors of art at Harvard said that this must have been the influence of Greek art in Indochina, and this could not have been the 9th century BC. And the logic was not anything else than this, that it was the Greeks who first showed movement in statuary. Since they were the first, this is Indochina, it must have been the influence of Greek art. And to this day, if you go to Greece on a tour, the tour guide will say these barbarian Persians almost captured Greece and extinguish the light of civilization. But of course, we just made it and kept this torch burning, and so forth and so on. Now, every single important Greek playwright, almost, has a play called The Persians, or the Persians appear in it. All the Greeks talk about the Persians. You do not have a single Persian work talking about the Greeks. Not one single one. Because if you look at what was going on at that time, the Persian Empire stretched from China to Greece. And Greece was a little country on the corners like Cuba and the United States. I mean, you hear about Cuba and Florida, but when you're in Montana, you only read about it in the newspapers. You don't think about Castro and Cuba. And nobody thought about this. When the Greeks were battling the Persians, there were 100,000 Greeks in the Persian army fighting against Greece. They were mercenaries. You did not have a single Persian fighting the Greek army against the Persians. And this was written by the Greeks. So you have a very, very different story going on. To call, I don't want to talk about the Persian because I happen to be a Persian, but to call the Achaemenian Persians barbarians is quite something. But this is the historiography has been developed. The idea of the Greek and the barbary. The idea that developed especially later on that everybody other than the Greeks were barbarians. And the word barbarian, which you use in the English language today, simply means non-Greek. That's all one needs to say. The idea that everybody is therefore everybody else is a barbarian. Now, of course, we know this not to be the case. Greek civilization itself, which is a very great civilization, was not the only civilization. And it did not grow out of a vacuum with suddenly a bang in the 6th century BC. It was the heir to several great civilizations before it, especially the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian, not to talk about the Phoenicians and all of the more local civilizations of the Mediterranean world. And in a sense, much that it did, especially in the field of science, was the synthesis of several thousand years of scientific activity in civilizations before Greece, which we do not want to take cognizance of. Because once we do that, we have to change our image of ourselves. As I told you, this great battle that's been going on for the last decade on American campuses on whether the origin of science is Greek or Egyptian, which has brought racial elements into it between the blacks and the whites in the United States, and all these things that are being written, all those debates that took place at Yale a few years ago that tore the campus apart, and you must have heard about it somewhere here and there, have to do with a very important point, that is a reappraisal of the West of itself. Now, there's a kind of paradigm shift is taking place in the West, without doubt, that we've seen in the field of science, in the field of history, in the field of culture. Even this debate is possible. Otherwise, if you were a 19th century British gentleman sitting in India, the greatest work of Hindu art, 11th century, let's say, dance of Shiva, something like that, would be considered as sort of childish compared to some Greek statuary of the 4th century BC. It was not even considered to be serious art. All world art was considered to be non-consequential until Kumaraswamy and others brought out its meaning. Now that this paradigm shift is gradually taking place, people dare talk about other civilizations from which the Greeks benefited. And all one has to do is to take Greece itself seriously, as I said before. That is, the Renaissance said Plato is a very great philosopher, Aristotle is a very great philosopher, down with all these Christian philosophers. We want to go back to the Greeks, independent of Christianity, not the Greeks integrated by Christianity. But nobody wanted to pay attention what Plato was saying. In his last great work, The Laws, where he talks about, in fact, I said the Atlantic civilization and its heritage in Greece, or what all the Pythagorean texts talk about ancient Egypt and its wisdom, of the ancient Persian philosophers that the Greeks wanted to learn from, and all of these things that the Greeks wrote about. The Renaissance was interested in the Greeks, but not in what the Greeks had to say about themselves, which is quite interesting. And so almost all the films, everything you see about the Greeks, begins with the idea that Greeks invented rationalism. Rationalism is wonderful, therefore the Greeks were wonderful. The syllogism is fundamental to the understanding of how modern civilization in the West looks upon Greek civilization. Now, we come to the main question, whether in fact it's wonderful or not. That's an evaluation. There's no doubt that Greece was the first ancient civilization in which religion became weakened to the point that from its cadaver, philosophy and science grew up independent of religion. There's no doubt about that. The statement can be shown to be historically true. I'll repeat that again. That is, religion weakened, and from its cadaver, I use this word on purpose, from its cadaver, science and philosophy developed as disciplines independent of religion. We do not see that phenomenon in Egypt, about which I spoke somewhat. We do not see it in Mesopotamia, of which Mr. Brailov spoke to you a little bit, and we shall not see it in China or India or the Islamic world, the other great civilizations of Asia to which we shall turn very soon. This happened in Greece. Now, whether this is good or bad, that depends on our philosophical position. But at least we have to be aware that this depends on our philosophical position. That's the important thing. When historical events like this take place, they're always give and takes. You lose something, you gain something. Greek civilization was sister to Persia and India. Those civilizations are still around, and Greek civilization died. Present Greece, despite having Olympics and so forth and so on in 1896, is not the continuation of ancient Greek civilization. Not even ethnically, according to many people. There's no doubt about that. It's not a direct continuity. Greek civilization died. It was captured by Rome, and it came to an end. Because the Greek religion died. Once the religion dies, the civilization that it creates dies. That is, in the form that it is, then it takes another form. It's reborn. But it's like what happened with the Egyptians. Now, the sister of Greek civilization, the Greek religion, Hinduism, is very much alive, and it's about 900 million people following it, or 800 million people. In India, it's dangerous. As soon as you make a statement, the population grows by several million, so I have to say it quickly. So it's still very much around. Zoroastrianism is still alive, not as numerous, but it didn't die out completely. And certainly survived centuries after the Greek religion. So that's what Greece lost. And what the people who we consider to be the great thinkers of Greece, like Plato, they believed they were living at the end of Greek civilization, not at its beginning. Nothing is more important for a Western student than to learn this fact, that what is called the golden age of Greece was for Plato the dark age of Greece. This is what you learn in other classes, the age of Pericles, and people think the Greeks were very democratic because Democritus invented atomism. That's nothing to do with democracy. But attribute all of these to the Greeks, the system of slavery that they had and all the other things that they had, but all of these qualities are attributed to the Greek world. That Greek world, the greatest philosopher of Greece, Plato, considered to be the end of Greek civilization. He considered the art of his period to be decadent Greek art. It's very, very interesting. You must know this as a fact, because this is not a question of interpretation of philosophy. Just open up Plato and read it. That is the art that is, let's say, in the Athens Museum, which of the 5th century BC, which people go from England or America to visit, or in fact in the British Museum. Some of it is right here in Washington, which is considered to be the peak of Greek art because it's human, it's humanistic. It was considered by Plato to be the death of Greek art, to be a non-symbolic, anthropomorphic, decadent art, which would end up actually in the death of civilization, death of the spirit. This is not the view of myself, it's the view of Plato. This is very important to know. So the great figures of Greek civilization, that what the West considered to be its own foundation from the Renaissance onward, that is Greek rationalism and individualism and humanism, so-called, was for the great philosophers of Greece who appeared in the 5th and 4th century BCs, the end of their civilization. And of course they were right, because that civilization came to an end. So this is a very, very important point to understand. Now, on the other hand, of course, the separation of philosophy and science first of all, led to the creation of this large corpus of speculative philosophy, which is the foundation of Western philosophy, and to a great flowering of the sciences, much of which, as I said, was the recapitulation of Babylonian science, especially in astronomy and mathematics, but also many new developments, which the Greeks carried out. There's no doubt about that. So both of these elements are present, and precisely because of this tension that existed in ancient Greece, the relation between religion and science in Greece is of very great interest in any course in religion and science, because almost all the major parameters exist for us today. All of the great thinkers in the West of the last few centuries who thought about these issues were very knowledgeable in Greek philosophy and Greek thought. In fact, in this aspect of Greek thought has not relinquished its hold upon modern science. We still try to use Greek letters for most functions in modern physics and mathematics. Greek names are used to the extent possible for many medical and pharmacological produce and products and things like that. So it's still very much alive. And such major 20th century physicists, philosophers, as Erwin Schrödinger, Werner Heisenberg, before the Max Planck, I mean, the leading physicists of the 20th century, were more philosophically minded. Those like Einstein, who were not that philosophically minded, didn't talk too much about them. These people had all read Greek philosophy. So it's still very much alive in the discussion between religion and philosophy today, religion and science today. And I said at the very beginning of this course, as soon as you say religion and science, there is an invisible partner in between, that is philosophy. And it's not possible to discuss religion and science in Greece without talking about the significance of philosophy. Now, putting aside the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Phoenicians and all of the archaic traditions, and coming to Greece itself, we can find, thanks to their remarkable scholarship that was carried out at the beginning of the 20th century by a number of Hellenic scholars, the roots of Greek philosophy and science in the Greek religious world, in the Greek religion. And still the best work in this field, which I mentioned already for you, I brought the book to class to show you, is this book of Francis Cornford, called From Religion to Philosophy, a study in the origins of Western speculation. No book has really replaced this book. This man was professor in England at Oxford University in the middle part of the 20th century, from about the 30s to the 50s. And he was the professor and teacher of Professor Guthrie, who later on became the greatest authority in Greek philosophy for the next 30 years, and who developed his ideas, which brings us right up to today. The Cambridge University, Professor Bernier and others are all students of this tradition, going back to Francis Cornford, and this is one of the most brilliant books really ever written by a Western scholar on this subject. I advise it very highly to those who are either philosophy students in this class, the graduate students, or those who are in general interested in the origins of Western speculations. I strongly suggest that you read this book. And if you don't have patience to read that, read this smaller text called Principium Sapienti, Principles of Wisdom, as a Latin title, but the book itself is in English, in very elegant English. Now, what I'm going to be saying is taken primarily as a summary of Cornford's thesis. This thesis has been challenged by others, there's no doubt about it. There are many different views. There's the Book of Dodds, The Religion of the Greeks, classical work. Many other works have been written on the subject, and I do not claim that this would be exhaustive, but the interpretation of Cornford has been so seminal in the last half century of scholarship concerning the origin of Greek philosophy and science and speculation in general that it's worthwhile for the class to hear something about it. And anyway, whatever is said, although some of its interpretations are challenged by others, nevertheless remain a central thesis for the understanding of how Greek philosophy and religion and science began. Now, in Greek texts themselves, we have a kind of hiatus that takes place, which you will detect globally throughout the whole world. And that is the hiatus between the early texts, which are called mythological, and the historical texts. And the hiatus is about the 6th century BC. Before that, you have the works of the two great Greek poets which have survived. Homer and Hesiod, whose names we must know in this class, whose works are mythological in language. They are, in fact, the source of Greek myth. Homer, of course, is the author of Ulysses and Iliad, and Hesiod is the author of the book called Theogony. This is a somewhat difficult term, so let me put it on the board for you. This is a term I expect us all to know. The word theogony comes from two words: theos, which means divinity, God, like theology, and the word goni from gonos, which means birth, generation, like Genesis, the first book of the Bible, comes from the same root, Genesis, and which we also have in English as the word genesis of something, which means the birth of something. So theogony means that philosophy, that science, that field of knowledge, whatever you want to call it, which deals with the genesis of the world from its divine origin. And this already implies belief in the divine origin of the world and the generation of the world. Without these two, there is no theogony. First of all, that if the world was itself divine, without any origin, it would not have a theogony. If there were to be an origin of the world based on pure material considerations, like some modern cosmologies, that would not be a theogony. So it needs these two elements. And the book of Hesiod itself is called Theogony. These are both written in poetry, in the form of poetry, and they are the two most fundamental origins, that is Homer and Hesiod, of our understanding of the Greek religion before the historical period. Now let me say something about this historical period. When we look at the whole world, those civilizations which have had long recorded history, there seems to be a jump from history to mythology about the 6th century BC. There's a kind of qualitative break in the flow of time. Now we're trying to connect the two through archaeology and all kinds of things. But the literature that was handed down to humanity over the ages is based actually on this cleavage, on this rupture. Something happened to human history in the 6th century BC. Karl Jaspers, the famous German philosopher, and following him many others have called this the axial age. That is, this was a period of major, first of all, spiritual renewal throughout the world. Within a period of a century, you have Confucius, Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Zoroaster, Pythagoras. All of these figures appear about the same time, and they changed the history of the world. Each of them founding a new religion or a new major religious movement. The whole history of China is transformed completely, the whole of the Far East, and through it, it's interesting that also Japan's history from the 6th century BC back is purely mythological. In the 6th century BC, you begin to get Japanese history. And Persia, the same thing. Zoroaster appears in the 6th century BC. After that, we have a recorded history of Persia, the great Achaemenid Empire, the first world empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, and then all of the other things, the conquest of Alexander, the coming of the Seleucids, and so forth. Before that, you have mythology. You have all of these mythical dynasties, the Pishtadians, and all of these groups, Kianian mentioned in the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi, and other sources of sort of Persian mythology. And the same happens in Greece. So there's a major event that takes place globally around the 6th century BC, and as far as the Greek texts are concerned, we jump from the world of myth to the world of ordinary recorded history. All of the jumps that we do now are through archaeology. I mean, we can say, well, this vase was of 1200 BC, so try to make a connection. But this other jump is through direct history. That is, we have the recorded history of Greece from the 6th century BC, step by step, until its destruction, the coming of Rome, and destruction of Rome, Western civilization, up to our own day. So there's a major cleavage that took place. Now, when we study the history of Greek religion, we find out that by the time the historical period begins, that religion is already in crisis. That is, 6th century BC is already a period of crisis of Greek religion. How do we know that? A religion begins to die when it becomes anthropomorphized, when the gods appear as men. Once you have the Olympian gods gambling in heaven with total indifference to what's going on down below, it's something seriously wrong. It doesn't take very long before that religion dies. So the 6th century BC is not the beginning of Greek religion. The beginning of Greek religion goes back into prehistory. It goes back to this mythological period. We think that Hesiod lived in the 8th century BC. But as I said, it's already another world. The heroes, the members of these great epics of Homer and Hesiod are not like Thucydides or Pericles or Aristotle. They are mythical figures. This is not a course on religion. I don't have time here to discuss it with you. But by mythical, I do not mean unreal. The greatest mistake to equate the mythical with the unreal. Like in English language, you say, well, this is just a myth. Of course, that's not what mythos means in Greek. And in this class, and all my classes, I was the last person in the world to equate the myth with the unreal. The historical is much more unreal than the mythical, in the final sense of the term, because the myth is, in a sense, an acted symbol. Belongs to the nether world, if you're going to use the Egyptian terminology. It belongs to the spiritual world. It transcends time. And that is why a myth is never confined to a particular moment. The Battle of 1812 between Napoleon and Russia is stuck in 1812. There it is. Even if Tchaikovsky composes an overture for it, and you hear about other places, but there it is. It's in 1812. The Civil War ended in 1865, and that's it. But let's say the Adventures of Ulysses, just to go back to Homer, they are not bound by a particular time like that. So the famous Irish writer James Joyce then writes a Ulysses in the 20th century on purpose, trying to up the myth of Ulysses in a contemporary term. Not that he succeeded, although one of the greatest writers of the English language, but nevertheless he tried. Much more successful with William Butler Yeats, his countryman, perhaps the greatest mythic poet of the English language of the 20th century. Yeats, all of whose, I'm sure I've heard of his name, for whom these myths, these Greek myths, are very much alive. Look at even the pseudo use of myth that we do. As soon as you have something that has to do with space and aircraft in space, we end up with Apollo. We end up with the Greek god of knowledge and the solar hero, Apollo. Have you ever thought of this? That, for example, you have a recording company that records very rare and ethereal music, classical music. It will be called Orpheus. And when you want to sell a product by having man think, you will have Rodin's Aristotle sitting like this. You can make money even out of the fact that these myths do not die. They're still very much with us. So when I say myth, I do not mean simply something unreal. Reality is not exhausted by historical reality, except for those who have a particular philosophical position, which excludes all non-modern people. for all non-modern people, the myth is more real than history. In a sense, history is an exemplification of the myth. For example, you could say, and this would be an affront to Christians, they didn't really understand what I was saying, that the historical Jesus is an entering into history of the mythical Christ. In this sense, not in the sense of those who are against Christianity, so this is all a myth, which means it's unreal. That is the solar hero, divinity incarnate, who therefore must be born at the time of the rise of the orbit of the sun, the 21st of December, 4 days before the winter solstice. Right? Why isn't Christ born on July 10th or something like that? Why is Christmas a solar date? Why did it have 12 apostles for the Last Supper? Why not 17? Of course, we just pass these by. We don't want to think about it, but because that is the myth of the sun, and of course the signs of the zodiac, and therefore the heavens, and the significance of Christ as being the S-U-N as well as the S-O-N of God, the Son in both senses of the term, who then is historically manifested in the Christian world in this particular historical event. So the Greek myth had that reality in this prehistorical period. By the time we get to the historical period, these myths haven't died, but gradually they become more and more anthropomorphized. That is, the Greek Olympian religion gradually begins to forget the relationship between the trans-historical myth and myth as simply human enactment. Zeus begins to appear as simply a strong man sitting on top of the clouds. And all of this Greek mythology was studied, of Paris and Helen and Hades and Jupiter and all of these things that you've studied, gradually become natural forces and related to anthropomorphized, while the relationship with the world of men is cut. They're doing their own thing, you might say, up there, when you read these stories. Not like what the God of Judaism or Christianity or Islam or the Hindu divinities, which are very similar to Greek divinities, do in the Hindu world. I mean, Hinduism, you never have Shiva just sitting up there, busy with Parvati or something like that. Shiva is involved in the life of the Hindus right in this world, and this gradually becomes lost. The severing of the bond between the divine world and the human world takes place, while the divinities become represented more and more in an anthropomorphic fashion. So the Greek pantheon gradually becomes irrelevant to the everyday life of people. Of course, it took several centuries. But this led to the decadence of the Greek religion, to actually finally its death, and the replacement of this religion by several different religious forces, finally ending up with Christianity, which becomes dominant in the Greek world and remains so to this day in that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, the southern part where the Greeks had some influence is then replaced by Islam. That is Alexandria and the Greek colonies in the southern part and the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And of course later on in Anatolia itself, in Turkey. Now, having said this, and I gave this long introduction, because I think it's very, very necessary to see what role science begins to play, and also philosophy begin to play in this context, because science comes upon the scene at a time when the hand of the gods is cut off from the on the scene at a time when the hand of the gods is cut off from the world of nature in a certain sense. They need another kind of science. Not a science which explains how the divine forces work in nature, but explains nature without recourse to the divine. Of course, Greek science never is totally cut off from traditional cosmology as modern science is, because the elements still retain something of a divine character for the Greeks. We shall see that in a moment. But anyway, that's the beginning of it. Now, there are two strands of religion in Greece, not one. Greek religion from the very beginning had the Olympian, and the Dionysian Orphic strands, which really correspond to the exoteric and esoteric. The Olympian religion was a social public religion. It was for everybody. The pantheon, the Greek pantheon, represented in Greek art, in its literature, is the Olympian pantheon. But then you had this mystical current in Greek religion, based on intimacy with the divine. Not Zeus sitting up there and throwing a thunderbolt, but dealing with a direct relationship between man and the divinity, which we would call the mystical dimension of religion, which was connected with these Dionysian Orphic mystery aspects of the ancient religions of Greece, and which survived precisely as mystery religions later on. Now, what happened to these two branches are very different. It was really the Olympian aspect of the Greek religion that became mundane, and as I said, the nexus between the archetype and its earthly embodiment was severed, and the archetype itself, that is the gods, began to be represented more and more in human fashion, but their abdication from the role in the world forced the Greeks to explain the world in the absence of the gods, and therein is the rise of Greek science, and also what we would call natural philosophy, because of course for the Greeks the study of nature was a branch of philosophy. It was called natural philosophy, and this was so important that Sir Isaac Newton's chair, now held by Hawkins at Cambridge University, is called the chair of natural philosophy, going back to the divisions given by Aristotle. So we call it science. Physics is the queen of all the sciences, but it was called natural philosophy. Anyway, to try to explain how nature functioned in the absence of the gods. Where the Dionysian Orphic continued, but began to manifest itself through the remarkable figure of Pythagoras as a new science, which was at the same time an ancient science, of mathematics wed to music and to mysticism. And so out of the Olympian religion, its decomposition, you might say, grows the physical and biological sciences of Greece, Greek science. And out of the Dionysian Orphic, the mathematical sciences. Of course, they meet later, but they're two very, very distinct strands in Greek thought. Now, to see how this process takes place, let me just analyze for you how the archaic Greek religion envisaged the world. The world was ruled by the gods. Each god possessed a province, was allotted a province by what was called Moira, a very, very key Greek term, meaning destiny, which is even more important than the gods. Moira comes before the gods. And these magnificent Greek plays, which in fact embody so much of the ancient Greek wisdom against the current of rationalism in Greek thought. It's very interesting. In a sense, they're reenactment of the myths for a Greek society at a time when the myths were no longer available directly. Moira, that is destiny, is always there as the ultimate and unbreakable, ineluctable reality of existence. So in the old Olympian worldview, the gods were allotted different parts of the world over which they ruled. And this was done by destiny, by the force of destiny, which was called Moira. I want us to jot down this Greek term, which is very, very significant. Therefore, each province over which a god ruled had its own characteristics. In the same way, not that the way we elect governors now who don't have that much power, but in the old days, supposing the King of France or the King of England, in the old days when kings really had power, would delegate someone to become the governor of Aragon, or in England, the governor of Kent. Now, and say you have complete power to do whatever you want. Obviously, the will of that person would then gradually become law or way of governing and how things were done. And in the next province, another person had been made governor who would have another kind of manifestation of how things were done. Now, transpose this to the world of nature. Each god was responsible for a domain in nature. So the will of that god became associated with what we would call the quality, characteristic, or law of that part of the natural world. For example, water is wet and cold. Fire is hot. It is because the god of fire was dominating over that domain of the world of nature which we call fire. And the characteristics of that god would cause that particular domain to be what it is. Whereas the god of water, Neptune, had certain characteristics which would cause that domain over which Neptune would rule to have other characteristics which we would call water. Is that clear? Is that clear? Because this is very, very fundamental for an understanding all of the ideas about physics, about law, about elements, characteristics of all science. There are 2,500 years of Western science, including modern science. Now, what happened when the gods abdicated? You have to explain how that water is still wet, and fire is still hot, and rocks are still unbreakable, and trees grow, and so forth and so on. The will of the particular divinity, absolutely essential for the understanding of Greek science and all other sciences, between the law of society and the law of nature, and ultimately the law of God. Because the origin of this nomos was really divine. And Plato says that nomos is the divine law that governs over the cosmos. It's picking up on these much earlier speculations. So in a sense, nomos replaces the will of the gods, allotted to them by Moira. Then there is in each domain transformation. Nothing is static in the world of nature. In the same way, nothing is static in human society. The law is static in the sense that it's an immutable law. But things which follow that law are not static, they're dynamic. Like in physics, like in modern physics. You say always everything is changing. No, the laws are not changing, although you can study the world of nature. You consider the law of gravitation to itself be immutable, but then you can have an apple fall, a star fall, a stone fall, and in fact cause everything to fall. So the world is dynamic, but the laws are not dynamic. In fact, that's a very important philosophical question we'll come up with at the end of this course, whether in fact the laws of the cosmos themselves are dynamic or not. We won't get into that now, but for the moment, do not mistake them between the two. So you have a process always becoming, change according to this nomos. And this domain in which the will of the gods ruled was called physis. And therefore would change and be transformed according to that will, which is now substituted for by nomos. Physis is the origin of the word physics, of course. But it doesn't mean physics at all. In fact, the way we understand, this was translated into Latin as natura, which comes from the Latin word means to cleave, to cut, a Latin verb. And then from the word natura comes the English word nature and all other European languages. Nature in French, nature in German, natura in Italian, same with all European languages. They use the Latin word and also European languages which are not of Latin origin. I don't mean only Portuguese, Italian, French, but English and German also use this term, so it's become universal. And it's very important to understand what its origin is. The Romans were not great speculators. They're great civilization from a practical point of view. They built bridges and roads and in the legal field, but when it came to philosophical speculation, they just adopted everything that the Greeks had, not everything, and much that the Greeks had done. In fact, they did not adopt everything. Most of what the Greeks had thought went to the Islamic world. They didn't come to the Rome at all. We shall get to that later on. But they did adopt this word natura from the Greek physis. And see how profound this is, going back to this early speculation. Right now in English we say, this is the nature of things. Or this is the nature of water. Ultimately, the echo of that is the effect of the will of that God that ruled over water in Greek thought. It's by virtue of that will that water has this particular nature. So the word physis came to mean two things, as we have in natura. One is the world of change itself, change, that which changes and becomes. And one is the characteristic of things, like we say the nature of this tree is different from the world of nature. In fact, the first usage of the term implies a certain immutability. He says it's the nature of diamond to be hard. If this were immutable, no lady would like to receive a diamond ring if tomorrow morning it's going to become like chewing gum or something like that. It's supposed to have this permanence, so we talk about the permanent nature, the nature of something. On the other hand, the other meaning of nature implies transience, change, becoming, the world of nature, by definition. So the next important term, which has been with us for the last 2,500 years, comes out of the same background. Now, just to clarify this for you, in early English, that is, let's say, Elizabethan English, the word physique, usually with a K, was associated mostly with the human body, with medicine. And gradually that usage was discontinued, except when we say he is a physician. We still refer to doctors as physicians. It's very confusing because in French, the same word physicien with an E rather than A means a physicist. The identical word practically in French. You don't use the word physicien in French as meaning physician in English. So this dual meaning of physique dealing with medicine and the science of physics is still with us in European languages. But we don't use the word physic as medicine anymore. But you do have texts in the Elizabethan period up to the 17th, 18th century even, where the term physique, with it usually CK, is used from the same root to mean medicine, that is that which deals with the nature of the body. Then gradually the science of physics develops, which, that's a new name for it, which was called natural philosophy, and in Latin, philosophia naturalis. And from the 18th century, in the English language, the word physics, with an S added to it, not physique. Physics develops as the science that we call physics. That is the science which tries to understand the nature of things, nature of the material world. Well, so you might say so does chemistry. But science, physics claims to be, in the Greek sense, of understanding the ultimate nature of things. So this is the second very, very important term. Then we have the third important term, the word element, whose Greek word we do not use, ostochoi in Greek. I did transliterate it into Latin for you. We use the Latin term. The elements were already there in Hesiod. The traditional cosmologies of the prehistorical period, not only among the Greeks, but also we find it in India, consisted these provinces, each having its own physis and nature, to be based upon ultimately four main elements, which all of us know: fire, air, water, and earth. Again, this is such a basic idea that you've all studied in high school or some elementary chemistry class, Avogadro's table. That is the elements in chemistry. And we always talk about the elements in modern society. Calcium, sodium, all these things that you're supposed to eat that are good for you or bad for you, these are different elements. Now this is an extension, an expansion of this classical Greek idea of element, which itself doesn't even belong to the Greek scientific age, but goes back to the theogony of Hesiod. And you also find it actually in Hindu texts of 1000 BC. It was something shared by the Indo-Iranian European cosmologies, religious cosmologies. And they have their equivalents also in Egyptian and Chinese cosmology and the like. That is the idea of elements as the essential building components. I don't want to say blocks because that gives you a kind of atomistic view of things. But that also goes back to this ancient Greek cosmology. Once the gods abdicated, the question then became, what is the nature of things? What is physis? What is the real underlying nature of things? And this is the origin of Greek, both philosophical and scientific speculation in the natural sciences. Thales said everything is made of water, Heraclitus said everything is made of fire, Anaximander said everything is made of air. You know the famous theories. I will not hold you responsible for who said what in this class. But the idea you must understand. Why is it that these people were trying to find what is the underlying reality? It's because the vacuum has been created. You had to explain this. And the mind of human beings is always drawn towards unity. So they try to find one single element of elements. One single quintessence, you might say. The word quintessence in English simply means the fifth element. The word essence in Latin also is another word for element. And quinta in Latin means five. So quintessence means the fifth element. So we use it in the English language all the time. This is the quintessence of his ideas. That means the elements themselves are already basic. So this is the basis of those basic things. So it becomes quintessence. So we still carry this idea with us. So people began to wonder what is the quintessence of things? What is the ultimate substance from which things are made, to try to explain physis? And it was against this idea that a major transformation was brought about by the Pythagoreans, who said the question is not what is the nature of things, but what is the structure of things. So they even changed the question. So we're not interested whether everything is made of water or fire or something like that. We want to know what is its structure. And this brings me now to the second tradition. This Dionysian Orphic tradition, as I said, was always based upon intimate relation with the gods or with the supreme divinity, ecstasy, induced through methods, spiritual methods, and it was their decadence that led to drinking. As with all of these things that we have in these fraternities and American campuses, where excessive drink is a sign of manhood, actually is an echo of the decadence of the Dionysian religions. You don't have any other civilization in the world. The Egyptians don't drink, the Japanese drink a lot of sake, but it's not in a very different context. It was, in a sense, these bacchanalian feasts and drinking parties and so forth, which are unique to Western civilization. No other civilization has it. Very interesting. I mean, Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, put aside Islam, in which this is forbidden by Islamic law. But in India, it's unthinkable. I mean, it's like nobody ever drank in India. But this was not part and parcel of this phenomenon. Ernst Benz, the great German philosopher of religion, one of the greatest scholars of religion of the century, he said it was the Bacchanalian and Dionysian aspect of Greek religion that hooked the Western soul on alcohol, which became very, very difficult to unhook. Anyways, I just mentioned this because of the profound impact that this had as this religion gradually decayed, in which drinking parties became ways of inducing spiritual states to reach God. I mean, that was it. So that was the way of reaching God, because these had decayed. But all of Dionysian and Orphic strands did not decay at all. The purely sapiental and spiritual message of this remained, wed very closely to the figure of Orpheus, the power of music, the relation between music and mathematics, and the significance of mathematics as providing the structure, to understand the structure of existence. These are all elements of this. I want to read for you just a passage of a Greek myth for you to realize how significant the power of music was in this tradition. Amphion and Zethos, twin sons of Zeus and Antiope, were like many heroes raised in secrecy to avoid the malevolent forces that sought to destroy them in their infancy. While they were growing up among the herdsmen on Mount Citharon, Amphion was favored by Hermes with the gift of a lyre. Remember, Hermes is a Greek god. Later on the Hermetic treatises appear. I'm going to talk about it. But here is the Greek god. Zethos, the more practical brother, taunted him for his devotion to the instrument, that is the lyre, the musical instrument, which seemed to prevent him from doing anything useful. So one brother is just playing music, which appears to be useless. But later, when the twins had conquered Thebes and were occupied in fortifying the city, it was Amphion's turn to smile. The music of that lyre caused the stones to slide effortlessly into place, while Theseus toiled to shift them with his own brawn. Thus the walls of seven-gated Thebes were raised through the power of music. It's a very famous Greek myth and story, myth in the real sense, which is very profound, because these stones moving by themselves, of course, means according to proportions, according to correct harmonic ratios, which enable you to dominate, in a sense, the physical forces that are involved. It's from this background, and especially associated with Orpheus, you must have heard of the myth of Orpheus, the flute that he had, that when he played the flute, he could conquer whole armies with it, and he could have buildings fall apart and put together, and all of these things. That dominates over this Dionysian Orphic strand of Greek thought, and far from being simply something interesting from the history of mythology, it's of the greatest significance for the understanding of the rise of mathematics among the Greeks with Pythagoras. And then, of course, flowering with such great figures as Euclid and Strabon, Theon, and many of the other great mathematicians of later Greece. And my time is up now. We'll be turning to the Pythagorean tradition next.